Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most misrepresented, misunderstood, and persistently mythologized institutions in all of Japanese history, the geisha, a world built entirely on artistic mastery, social intelligence, and an economy that is significantly more complicated than a Western opera made it sound. Not courtesans, not concubines, not whatever Puccini was imagining in 1904 when he apparently decided he understood Japan. If you're genuinely enjoying this kind of slow, specific, wryly observed deep dive into history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely helps. A huge thank you to one of you for suggesting this topic, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what your most confidently wrong assumption about Japan used to be. I'll be reading them. Get comfortable. Lights low, fan on, blanket up, maybe don't eat anything right now, because we are going to describe a lot of very expensive silk, and eating near expensive silk is exactly the kind of thing the kenban would have flagged. Have you ever wondered how a profession started by male jesters at banquets quietly became one of the most rigorously trained artistic careers in human history? Why did a government edict in 1779 specifically require women to carry their shamisen visibly in public, as if the shamisen were a licensed firearm? How do you charge for entertainment by the length of a burning stick of incense? And what happens if the conversation gets good and you let it burn down too fast? Could you survive a training pipeline that starts at age 4, costs $1 million, and begins with you doing laundry? The white face makeup. Did anyone mention it contained lead? The debt. The one that started accruing before you could read and followed you into adulthood. Was there actually an exit? And seriously, what exactly was Puccini's source material? Because it was wrong in almost every direction simultaneously. Congratulations, you just woke up in Kyoto's Gion district, 1880. The gas lamps are just starting to replace the candles, though most Okaya are keeping the lighting deliberately dim anyway, because progress is fine, but atmosphere is non-negotiable. You are wearing approximately one craftsman's annual salary on your back. Your obi is tied at the rear, as legally required, and someone in the next room is tuning a shamisen. The sound is high, sharp, and precise. It means the evening is about to begin. Good luck. You are at a wealthy lord's banquet, and your job, stripped of its elegant title, is roughly this. Make them laugh, flatter them constantly, pour their drinks before they notice the glass is empty, and under no circumstances be boring. You are a taikomochi, the original geisha, though at this point the word geisha doesn't exist yet. Your profession translates loosely as art. The art is mostly surviving sustained proximity to powerful men who are 3 flasks of sake into their evening and have very specific opinions about what makes a good story. You have heard all their stories. Byokon. You will find them funny again. Maybe to say. Let's talk about what this actually requires. You walk in carrying a fan, a rehearsed compliment, and the situational awareness of someone whose continued employment depends on correctly reading the mood of a room full of armed men. You redirect failing conversations before they collapse into awkward silence, or, worse, an argument between people who are carrying swords. You refill the cup before the cup is empty. She is... You laugh at the story about the hunting trip for what is, conservatively, the 14th time. That's basically a senior account manager at a firm where all the clients are armed and none of them have performance reviews. It just doesn't look like one from the outside. The taikomochi tradition traces back to the court entertainers of the Muromachi period, men who served powerful daimyo as something between a trusted companion and an institutional mood manager. By the early 1600s, there are enough banquets, enough powerful men, with enough sake budget, and enough awkward silences that need professionally smoothing over that someone had to be trained specifically for this. You're the result. You arrive carrying a fan, a sharp sense of timing, and several years of training in music, dance, comic monologue, and the precise calibration of flattery that doesn't tip into obvious sycophancy. Nobody likes obvious. Obvious is embarrassing for everyone. Now, the word taikomochi means literally, drum carrier. An earlier iteration of your predecessors would carry a hand drum for their lord as a symbol of service and accompaniment. By the Edo period, the drum is largely ceremonial as a concept. You don't actually haul percussion everywhere, but the role has retained the name, and what you carry instead is the entire social atmosphere of the room. You read who's in a bad mood before they know they're in a bad mood. You are the human equivalent of a playlist that adjusts in real time. Except you can't skip a track when a lord decides he wants to sing. The drum is symbolic. The song is not optional. Of course there's a hierarchy. There's always a hierarchy. Senior taikomochi at the most prestigious Edo banquet houses held something close to celebrity status in the circuits of wealthy entertainment culture. A truly skilled taikomochi could improvise a comic narrative, deflect an insult with a compliment so smooth the insulted party thanked him, and pivot seamlessly from bawdy humour to refined classical illusion, depending on who just walked in. This is the Ryan Seacrest of feudal Japan, but with significantly higher stakes and no earpiece. A bad reading of the room didn't get you negative reviews. It got you escorted out of a patronage relationship you needed to survive. This is where the female geisha enter the picture, slowly at first, then decisively. By the 1750s, women had begun performing, alongside taikomochi, at the licensed entertainment districts, bringing shamisen and dance rather than comic monologue as their primary offering. The lords noticed. The bookings shifted. By 1800, the women had taken over the profession almost entirely, and the taikomochi had been nudged into a narrower ceremonial role they'd never quite recover from. Today there are fewer than a dozen active taikomochi in all of Japan. The drum carrier carried the drum to the very end. Nobody asked him to stay. You are a taikomochi working the banquet circuit in the 1760s, and something is happening that nobody says out loud, but everyone has noticed. The female performers are getting all the bookings. They started as accompanists, background musicians at oiran tea houses, there to provide a musical layer and stay out of the way, and somewhere between 1750 and 1800, the clients simply started preferring them. The conversation was better, apparently. The room energy was different, apparently. By 1800, women dominate the profession entirely. The taikomochi guild watches its market share evaporate with the dignified composure of a company whose product has just been replaced by a more efficient version of itself. Let's talk about what these early female performers were actually doing, because it wasn't what Puccini thought. You were working alongside oirang, the high-ranking courtesans of the licensed pleasure districts, and the distinction mattered enormously to everyone involved. The oiran handled the other business. You, having started calling yourself geisha, handled the room. You played shamisen. You danced. You kept the conversation moving through 3-hour banquets, without making anyone feel watched. This is not a casual skill set. It's the equivalent of being a live DJ, a sommelier, and a talk show host, simultaneously, except the talk show format had been running continuously for decades, and the audience expected you to be effortless. Now, the word itself is doing some work here. Gi means art or performance. Sha means person. Geisha, person of the arts. Not person of the flowers, not person of the evening, not any of the other translations that got applied later by Western novelists who'd spent 3 weeks in Nagasaki and felt qualified to write a whole novel about it. Pierre Loti published Madame Chrysantheme in 1889, which is basically the original Wikipedia article written by someone who'd never read the source material. Puccini turned it into an opera in 1904. The gap between that cultural product and the actual profession it claimed to describe is somewhere between loosely inspired by and legally distinct. The Tokugawa government noticed the growth of female geisha, and in 1779 issued an edict making the distinction official and structural. You were prohibited from engaging in sexual commerce. You were required to carry your shamisen visibly, proof of trade, when travelling between engagements, and the obisash, which courtesans tied at the front for practical reasons, had to be tied at the back. The back-tied obi became the single most visible regulatory garment in Japanese history. One sash placement. Entire professional identity. The Tokugawa administration basically drew a line between two professions using textile logistics. The restaurant industry would like you to know it still does this. Your server's mandated apron agrees. Of course, the edict didn't eliminate overlap. It documented the boundary and moved on, which is what edicts do. The kenban, the district registry office, would handle the tracking. Every geisha in every hanamachi was registered, her performances logged, her income recorded, her engagement scheduled through the office, like a staffing agency that also had opinions about your collar. The kenban knew where you were every evening. It knew what you charged. It knew what you owed. It was less a regulatory body and more a very organized, very quiet accountant who'd been given unusual amounts of institutional authority and intended to use all of it. You need to register in a hanamachi, and this decision operates in the social logic of the karayukai, roughly like choosing your nationality. The 5 major hanamachi of Kyoto, Gion-kobu, Gion-higashi, Miyagawa-cho, Ponta-cho, and Kamishi-chiken are not just addresses. Each has its own clientele, its own dance school, its own character, and its own quietly held opinion of the other 4. Gion-kobu is the most prestigious. This is not disputed. Gion-kobu is also fully aware of this fact, which is a quality that the other 4 hanamachi find informative and slightly exhausting. You have made your choice. You will now live inside its implications. Let's talk about Ponte-cho. It's a single narrow alley running along the western bank of the Kamigawa River, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass without turning sideways. There's no grand entrance, no gate, no signage, announcing that this cramped stone corridor produces some of the most expensive evenings in Japan. In summer, the tea houses open wooden platforms over the river, yuka they're called, where patrons pay a premium specifically for the breeze and the sound of moving water, which is essentially selling ambient noise at restaurant prices. Pontocho doesn't apologize for this. The river keeps moving. The bill keeps climbing. Gion-kobu operates under the Inoue-ryu dance tradition, which has been the dominant school in the district since the early 19th century. You don't simply study it. You're absorbed into it. Every movement, every hand position, every controlled stillness has a correct form that you're expected to internalize over years of repetition until it stops feeling like technique and starts feeling like your body's only available option. It's less like learning choreography and more like being slowly reformatted. The Miyako Odori, the cherry blossom dance performed annually in Gion-kobu since 1872, is still running today, which makes it older than most functioning governments and considerably better organized. Kamishi-chiken is the oldest of the 5 hanamachi, tucked into the northwest corner of the city near the Kitano Tenmangu Shrine. It's quieter, less trafficked. The clientele tends toward established patrons rather than new money, which is a polite way of saying it isn't interested in explaining itself to anyone who needs an explanation. Kamishi-chiken's Kamogawa Odori has also been performed since 1872. Both districts have been doing their spring dance performances continuously for over 150 years, through Meiji modernization, 2 world wars, and the invention of television. Not bad for something the internet occasionally describes as a dying tradition. Now, each hanamachi has its own kenban, the registry office that tracks every geisha in the district, every engagement, every fee, every contractual arrangement. You don't walk into an akeyara and ask for a table. You contact the kenban contacts the ochaya. The ochaya considers whether you are the kind of person it would like to confirm, and this consideration takes however long it takes, and you wait. It's the original Eventbrite, except the event is you, and cancellations have social consequences that extend well beyond losing a deposit. The kenban also maintains the records on your debts, which at this stage of your training are already accumulating with the quiet confidence of a mortgage. Miyagawa-cho and Gion-higashi sit in the middle of this hierarchy, respected, distinct, not Gion-kobu. Miyagawa-cho developed its own dance tradition, wakeagiyu, and maintains a reputation for a slightly more accessible atmosphere than its more august neighbour. Gion Higashi is occasionally described, in the careful language of people who live inside these distinctions, as more intimate. What this means in practice is a smaller community, fewer geisha, and a clientele that isn't always trying to get a table at Jian Kobu. The okasan of your okiya already knows which dance master will correct your posture on Tuesday mornings, which okeya will book you first, and which rival hanamachi's geisha you will smile at warmly and never quite trust. You don't book any of this. It was arranged before you arrived, and the paperwork was filed while you were still learning how to walk in your sandals without wincing. Everything you earn passes through the kenban first. The kenban is the geisha registry office in your district, the institution that tracks every booking, every performance fee, every debt, every contractual relationship in a ledger that belongs to the kenban and not to you. You don't invoice clients. The kenban does. You don't collect your earnings directly. The kenban collects them, takes its percentage, and forwards the remainder according to schedule. It's your booking agent, your accountant, and your compliance officer, simultaneously, running out of an office you didn't choose and can't dismiss. The kenban knows your finances better than you do, and it'd like you to remember that. Let's talk about how the fees actually work. The basic unit of geisha billing is the senko dai, the incense stick price. 1 unit of time equals roughly 1 burning incense stick, which is approximately 1 hour. You're not paid by the skill you demonstrate, or the particular artistry of your shamisen performance that evening. You're paid by how long you were present in the room, measured against a slow-burning stick. It's essentially shift work, except the uniform costs more than most people's cars, and the office reviews your posture. Now, a top-tier Gion Kobu geisha in the Meiji period might charge the equivalent of a skilled carpenter's full week of wages for a single evening. The carpenter builds an entire structure. You play 3-string instruments and demonstrate conversational intelligence without spilling sake on anyone. The market has spoken. The kenban records it in the ledger without comment, deducts its portion, and the okiya, your house, takes another share before anything reaches you. By the time the remainder arrives, it's already passed through more hands than a $20 bill at a farmer's market. This is where the okiya enters the picture. The okiya is the tea house where engagements actually take place, the venue, the host, the social filter. You don't go wherever you're requested. New clients can't simply walk in and book an evening. They require an introduction from an existing patron, a social vouching process that functions less like a reservation system and more like getting approved for a co-op board in Manhattan, except the co-op has better food and considerably stricter aesthetic standards. The okasan, the house mother, maintains relationships with both the geisha and the clients, and she decides what happens and when. The kenban coordinates all of it on paper. Nobody acts without the paperwork reflecting it. Of course, the okeya doesn't pay you directly either. The okiya bills the client. The kenban invoices the okiya. The okiya receives a portion. You receive what remains. There are at minimum 4 institutions between you and the money a client hands over for your company, and every one of them has a legitimate operational claim on a percentage. It's the most elaborately bureaucratic form of artistic performance in human history. The Spotify royalty structure would feel transparent by comparison. Meanwhile, the ledger grows. Every kimono, every lesson, every shamisen string, every pot of camellia oil used to dissolve the white makeup, all of it is recorded against your name as debt. The kenban tracks it, the okiya extends it, your future earnings are the collateral. You don't carry the ledger carries you. Some geisha performed for decades and still didn't close the balance. The numbers were patient. They had nowhere else to be. The Tokugawa government has, in 1779, issued a set of rules about your profession, and the rules are specific. You're to tie your obi at the back. Oiran tie theirs at the front. You're to carry your shamisen visibly when travelling between engagements, not tucked away, not wrapped, but present and identifiable as professional equipment. You're not to engage in sexual commerce. The shogunate has strong opinions about fabric. The direction of your sash is now a legal document. You are, in the Tokugawa regulatory framework, a person who can be identified from across the street and filed correctly. The shogunate has a functioning licensed quarter, the Yoshiwara in Edo, the Shimebara in Kyoto, and it runs on licensing fees the way a modern city runs on parking fines, aggressively, and with deep personal investment in the geography of the violation. You operate outside those walls, in tea houses, at banquets, in the hanamachi. This means you're not on the fee schedule, you're not in the registry. You are, from the tax authority's perspective, a knot facing the wrong direction in an otherwise legible system. So you tie the sash in the back, you bring the shamisen out in the open, and the shogunate writes this down and considers the matter resolved. The shamisen itself is not a casual prop. It's made from red sandalwood or mulberry wood, strung with silk, and traditionally skinned with cat or dog hide stretched across the resonating body. A quality instrument costs several months of a workingman's wages, which means you're carrying the equivalent of a used car through the stone-paved streets of Kyoto in January, at 3 degrees Celsius, in a lightweight kimono, on okobo sandals that restrict your gait to something between a glide and a controlled stumble, visibly, as required by law. Now the obi direction rule sounds almost too small to be serious, the difference between a knot in front and a knot in back as the legal line between two professions. But the Tokugawa bureaucracy has always been comfortable with this level of granularity. This is a government that regulated the number of hairpins a merchant's wife could wear based on her husband's annual income. Sash orientation is well within scope. The European equivalent would be the EU's cucumber curvature regulations, except with higher stakes and no appeals process. This is where the edict gets complicated in practice. The 1779 rules draw a line, but enforcement is happening in dimly lit tea houses, where the whole point is that nothing is being documented too carefully. The kenban tracks your bookings and your fees. It doesn't station an inspector at the door to check knot placement. Nobody writes a policy memo. Nobody needs to. Step out of line and people talk about it. In the hanamachi, being talked about is the appeals process, the disciplinary hearing, and the verdict, all running concurrently. Of course, by the time this edict appears, the Yoshiwara and the Shimebara are formal, expensive, and increasingly beside the point. A patron books an evening there and receives a transaction dressed in ceremony, which is the licensed quarter's entire problem and yours to quietly benefit from. You arrive at a banquet, you tune the shamisen, you hold a conversation that goes nowhere useful and costs a great deal of money, and at no point does anyone acknowledge what any of it is. The government issues you a dress code. Ward. Your sash goes in the back. The shamisen stays visible. The oiren aren't consulted. You arrive at the okiya somewhere between the ages of 4 and 10, and your initial role is not student, not apprentice, not performer in any meaningful sense. It is servant. You are a shikomi, which means you sweep, clean, assist the senior geisha with their preparations, run errands, answer the door, and stay quiet. Nobody explains the house rules to you directly. The rules are absorbed through consequence, through the specific silence that follows a mistake, through watching which tasks are noticed when they are done, and which are noticed more sharply when they are not. You are being trained in everything. None of it has been labelled as training yet. Let's talk about the floor. You know the floor very well. You know which boards announce visitors, and which ones you've learned to step around, because the okiya has opinions about unexpected noise. You know how the tatami smells after it's been swept, dry rice straw, and something faintly mineral. You know where the senior geisha sets her kimono when she returns from an okaya in January, still cold from the stone-paved streets, and you know your job is to make sure it's properly aired before morning. You receive no wages for this, accumulate no credit toward anything, and contribute several years of your complete attention. which is the arrangement where someone works very hard building someone else's business and calls it an education. Except here the commute is longer, and the dress code is significantly worse. Now, every lesson that follows, shamisen instruction, dance practice, flower arranging, tea ceremony, conversation etiquette, gets recorded against your future earnings in the Okiya's ledger. The debt system is called the Flower and Willow Debt, which is a genuinely beautiful name for what is functionally a tab you didn't agree to run up. Training a single maiko from Shikomi through her full debut costs somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in modern equivalent. The ledger doesn't ask your opinion. It just grows. Of course, the Shikomi stage isn't only sweeping. You're watching. You're absorbing posture, timing, how to enter a room without announcing yourself, how to pour sake from a tokiri flask without a single wasted motion. You learn when to speak and when to laugh, and when to redirect a conversation that's sliding somewhere inconvenient, not from a lesson, not from a manual, but from standing in the kitchen while the women above you do it, and standing in the hallway while they do it again, and being corrected so quietly you're not entirely sure you were corrected until you replay the moment later. The orchestrated watches everything. She has not mentioned this. You know anyway. This is where the minarai stage begins. Minarai meaning roughly learning by watching. You accompany a senior geisha to the okeya, and you sit. You don't perform. You observe the ozashiki banquet from a corner of the room, watching how an evening is managed, how sake is warmed and offered, how a joke lands, and how a conversation is steered away from a subject that's going badly. You're essentially sitting in on a masterclass you aren't allowed to speak during, which makes it either deeply educational or profoundly boring depending on the night, probably both. The next stage is maiko, which is where the red and white collar appears, the elaborate fur-sewed kimono that costs a craftsman's yearly wages, and the okobo sandals that restrict your stride to something between a careful shuffle and a formal procession. The sandals have opinions. The kimono has opinions. Your gait is now an aesthetic statement whether you intended it to be or not. You're not a full geisha yet. That's the erike ceremony, the turning of the collar from red and white to plain white, still ahead of you. But you're no longer the person who answers the door. You've graduated to the person others watch from across the room, trying to figure out every single thing you do wrong. You are a minarai now, which means you have cleared the servant stage and entered a phase where you attend actual ozashiki banquets and do almost nothing. You sit. You observe how the senior geisha navigates a difficult client, steers a conversation away from a subject that's about to become a problem, and exits a scene with grace while appearing to have simply moved on organically. You're not paid for this. Your presence is an educational investment, which means it's, in the hanamachi's accounting, a line item on your debt. You're learning the job by being present while the job happens, and the job isn't free to observe. Here's what you're actually watching. The senior geisha, your wani-san, your older sister, in the professional sense, is managing three things at once. She's tracking the mood of every person in the room, monitoring how much sake has been poured and for whom, and performing a kind of conversational triage that would make a crisis PR consultant genuinely nervous. A client says something slightly too pointed. She hears it, acknowledges it with a sound that means nothing, and redirects the room toward a drinking game before anyone has time to feel awkward. The whole maneuver takes about 11 seconds. You file it away. The ozashiki room itself is working on you too. The tatami smells faintly of dried rush grass. Tokiri flesks sit warming in shallow bowls of hot water, releasing that low-grain scent of heated sake into the air. Lacquerware catches the lamplight. Okiya keep their rooms deliberately dim, even after electric light becomes available, because the older atmosphere is the point. You're sitting in a room that has been carefully engineered to feel timeless, and part of your training is learning to become a native element of that engineering. You're not decorating the room. You're supposed to eventually be the room. Now, this stage lasts roughly a month. 1 month of attending banquets. watching, absorbing, and saying almost nothing. You're valuable enough to be in the room. You're not valuable enough to be compensated for being in the room. The debt ledger agrees, and the debt ledger has no feelings about this whatsoever. This is where the minarai system gets specific. You're not attached to a random okia for your observation month. You're placed with a particular tea house, called your minarai jaya, which essentially sponsors your presence. The okasan of your okia arranges this. The okia gains a small ornamental novelty. You gain proximity to working professionals. The kenban records it. Everyone has a role in the transaction except you, in the sense that your role is to not have a role yet, and to watch what having a role actually looks like up close. Think of it as an unpaid LinkedIn internship, except the platform is a 200-year-old tea house, and the networking fee compounds daily. You're also being observed. The clients notice you. The senior geisha notices how you sit, how you hold your hands, whether your attention drifts. An ozashiki isn't a classroom with a one-way window, it's a live performance, and you're sitting inside it while it runs. Every senior in the room is quietly assessing whether you belong here. Not unkindly, just accurately. The room has standards, and the room has been applying them since before your okasan was born. You watch the shamisen come out. High, sharp plucking sounds as the strings are tuned. A clean, percussive signal that the entertainment portion is beginning. The senior geisha's posture shifts almost imperceptibly. She's no longer managing the conversation. She's inhabiting a different register entirely. There's a word for what you're watching. Several words, actually. And at least one has a dedicated seminar at a mid-range hotel conference center. It's not that. It's considerably more difficult and considerably less discussed. Your misidashi, your formal maiko debut, involves being introduced to the tea houses, patrons and professional networks of your okia in full regalia, speaking in the Kyoto dialect, which is what you speak now, regardless of what you spoke when you arrived. You are presenting yourself as a professional in training, and as an advertisement for the okia simultaneously, because in the hanamachi these are the same thing. Every gesture, every conversational response, every public appearance accumulates into a reputation that will either sustain your career or create complications for it. This is the first entry in your public professional record. It is also a test. Nobody mentions that it is a test. The regalia isn't decorative, it's information. Your fur-isode kimono, the long-sleeved style worn by unmarried women, signals your exact stage of training to anyone who knows how to read it. The obi sash is tied in a long trailing style called dorari, hanging almost to the floor, embroidered with the okia's crest. Your okubo sandals add several inches of height and produce a specific wooden knock against the stone streets, which is the sound of an approaching maiko. You don't arrive quietly. You announce. The outfit costs roughly what a skilled carpenter earns in a year, and the okia has recorded every sen of it. Now, the makeup. Your face is white, shiranuri, applied over camellia oil and set with powder. The lips are painted a small, precise red, smaller than your actual lips, because proportion here is a formal decision. At the back of your neck, the white makeup is applied in 2 or 3 pointed lines, leaving the natural skin visible between them. A technique called eri eshi, considered one of the most striking visible details of the maiko appearance. The neck exposure is deliberate. Early versions of this formula contained lead compounds, which is essentially the hanamaki's version of a goop wellness product, except with more verifiable consequences. The social mechanics get specific here. Your misadashi lasts 3 days. Each day, you visit tea houses and senior geisha with your wanisan, your elder sister geisha, assigned to guide you through your debut, and you present a small gift, typically a folded paper fan. You bow. You speak. You do not perform yet. You are being catalogued. The tea house proprietresses, the okasan of your okia, the kenban office. Everyone is updating their internal record of who you are and what you might become. It's less a debut and more an onboarding process, except nobody calls it that, and the uniform costs significantly more than anything LinkedIn requires. The reality, you're also watching the room watch you. Patrons who attend ozashiki during your debut period are evaluating your conversational ease, your composure, and whether you seem like someone worth returning to see. The kimono has the okiya's crest on it. You did not choose the crest. The crest has been here longer than you have, and it has opinions about your posture. Potential Dana patrons are present, and they are not here for the tea. They are calculating whether sponsoring your career is worth the outlay, the way a venture capitalist calculates runway. Except the asset is a person, and nobody is putting together a deck. The crest on your sleeve is the pitch document. It does not ask how you're feeling about any of this. Meanwhile, the debt is already accumulating. The misadashi kimono, the accessories, the sandals, the hair ornaments, kanzashi, which in a maiko's first season are elaborate seasonal arrangements that a senior craftsman in the Nishijin district spent weeks constructing. Each piece is recorded. The flower and willow debt doesn't pause for the debut. It expands because of it. Your first public appearance is funded by money you don't yet have, which you'll earn at banquets you haven't been invited to yet. The accounting is immaculate. The balance is not in your favor. Nobody presents this as unusual. The erike is the ceremony in which your collar changes from red and white to plain white, which, described in those terms, sounds like a minor update to a dress code policy. In the logic of the hanamachi, it is the formal transition from maiko to full geiko. The moment your apprenticeship ends and your career begins, everything before this point has been accumulating. Lessons, costumes, meals, accessories, and each one logged against your name. The erike does not clear the ledger. It changes the status of what is owed from investment being made to investment that now has a repayment timeline. The collar is white. The math continues without acknowledgement. Here's what actually changes. The red and white eri, the split collar visible at the nape, has been your identifying mark for years. It signals apprentice, trainable, in progress, not yet finished. The plain white collar signals geiko, finished, deployable, billable at the full rate. Think of it as the difference between an intern badge and a staff ID, except the intern badge took 5 years to remove and cost approximately the GDP of a small municipality. The makeup formula stays the same. The debts stay the same, the collar changes colour, and everyone nods. Now, the physical adjustments are real. You stop wearing the heavy furry sewed kimono with the long trailing sleeves. You stop wearing the dorariobi, the long dramatic belt that draped nearly to the floor and required assistance to tie correctly every single evening. The okobo sandals, those high lacquered wooden platforms that produced the hollow knock against stone streets and restricted your stride to something between a walk and a negotiated movement, those go too. A full geiko silhouette is cleaner, closer, less architectural. The jacquard loom furisode was 4 to 6 weeks of labour and cost a craftsman's annual salary. You won't miss carrying it, exactly, but you've been wearing it for years, and your body has organised itself around it. The Dana relationship becomes relevant here if it hasn't already. A Dana is a wealthy patron who agrees to sponsor a geiko's ongoing costs, kimono commissions, accessory maintenance, seasonal wardrobes, in exchange for exclusive priority on her company and conversation at engagements. It's the original Patreon, except the creator can't post from her phone and the subscriber expects to be the only one with access. Not every geiko acquires a Dana immediately. Some never do. The ones who do find that the financial ceiling of the debt system becomes navigable. The ones who don't find that it simply takes longer. Meanwhile, the kenban updates its records. Your category shifts in the registry. Your fee rate adjusts upward. The yakuya where you perform now list you differently in the scheduling system they maintain, a system that the kenban monitors with the attentiveness of a mid-sized accounting firm that has personal feelings about punctuality. A geiko arriving late to an engagement is not just inconvenient. It is a scheduling failure that the kenban notes, and the kenban's notes have a way of following you. None of this is visible at the erike itself. The ceremony is precise and composed. You change the collar. The women of the okiya observe. There's no applause mechanism built in, no moment of formal acknowledgement that you've just spent years arriving at this point. The white collar is simply on, and the room moves forward. Somewhere in the kenban's ledger, a column updates. The incense keeps burning. You owe money. You have owed money since approximately the day you arrived, and the number has been growing in one direction ever since. Every lesson, every kimono, every hairpin, every supervised evening of training, every meal has been entered against your name as the hana to yanagi, the flower and willow debt. It's not framed as punishment. It's framed as the accumulated cost of everything you've been given, which is your entire life as you currently know it. The debt doesn't carry interest in the conventional sense. It operates more like gravity, not accelerating on paper, just consistently present, consistently larger than last time you checked, persistently occupying the same direction. Here's what's actually on the ledger. Chiao-prude. The obvious entries are there. Shamisen lessons, dance instruction, ikebana, tea ceremony, the years of room and board in the okiya. But then it gets specific in the way only a system with decades of practice can manage. The okobo sandals, the camellia oil for removing your makeup, the rice bran cleanser, the lacquer comb that broke during a fitting, individual hairpins, recorded by type. A single furry-sewed kimono commission runs 4 to 6 weeks on a Nishijin jacquard loom and costs the equivalent of an ordinary craftsman's yearly wage. And you're not getting one furry-sewed, you're getting a wardrobe that rotates seasonally, because showing up in the wrong fabric weight in July would be a social event of the wrong kind. Each piece lands in the ledger before you've worn it once. The kenban registry office keeps the accounting, which means there's a formal institutional record of exactly how indebted you are at any given moment, the geisha equivalent of a credit score, except the score isn't yours to check casually, and checking it doesn't help anyway. Think of it less like a bank statement and more like a terms and conditions document that was signed on your behalf when you were a child, by someone who had already agreed to the terms. The debt moved in when you did. It got comfortable. Now, the repayment mechanism is your fees. After erike, after the collar turns white and the kenban updates your status, a portion of every evening's ozashiki earnings flows back toward the okiya. A top-tier geiko in Gion-Korbu during the Meiji period might charge the equivalent of a skilled carpenter's weekly wage for a single evening's engagement. That sounds like traction, and it is, until you account for the kimono she wore to that engagement, the accessories selected to match the season, and the client's known taste, the shamisen restrung that week because the gut strings don't last, and the okiya's administrative cut, which isn't optional and isn't itemized in a way that invites discussion. Some geisha paid it off. Some geisha earned enough, quickly enough, with a dana's financial backing covering ongoing costs, to see the number actually move. A dana absorbs the current costs, you perform, and the ledger stabilizes, which is basically the afterpay of feudal patronage, except missing a payment had social consequences that no app could process, and the app would also have opinions about your obi. The dana absorbs the current costs. The gaiko performs. The ledger stabilizes, if not clears. And yet some geisha never fully escaped it. The debt had a way of replenishing itself. A new season required a new kimono. A commission piece required new accessories. A tear in the lining of a formal outer robe required replacement, not repair, because the social stakes of the okiya didn't allow for visible mending at that tier. The ledger stayed warm. The kimono had opinions about this, and those opinions were expensive. A gaiko with outstanding obligations performed. A gaiko with a cleared ledger had choices, which meant she could, in theory, stop. You could walk away from the okiya the way you could walk away from a mortgage. Technically, if the number reaches 0, and the number reaches 0 around the same time. The okiya noted when a ledger cleared, Then it noted what needed replacing that season. The accounting continued either way. Your time has a price, and the price is denominated in burning objects. 1 senko dai, 1 incense stick price, represents roughly the duration of 1 stick of incense burning down, which is approximately 1 hour. This is the unit in which your services are billed, which makes Geisha billing the only known professional invoicing system built around combustion. You do not set your rate directly. The kenban handles the numbers, but the rate at a top-tier Gionochaya, the rough equivalent of a skilled carpenter's weekly wage for a single evening, is understood by all parties before anyone sits down. The incense burns. The kenban writes the figure. You move to the next room. The kenban, it's not a box office. It's not a talent agency. It's closer to the IRS if the IRS also handled your social calendar and had opinions about your posture. Every geisha district runs one, a registry office that tracks active geisha, their bookings, their fees, and their contractual relationships with specific okaya. You don't negotiate directly with a client. The kenban does that. You receive your schedule, you appear at the correct tea house at the correct hour, and the kenban reconciles the ledger afterward. It's the original Eventbrite, except there's no refund policy, and the confirmation email is delivered in person by someone in silk. Now, getting into the okaya at all isn't straightforward. You can't simply walk in and request entertainment. No new client enters an okaya without an introduction from an existing patron, a formal social vouching process that functions less like hospitality and more like joining a private members club where the application fee is someone else's reputation. The okaya proprietress, the okasan, decides whether an introduction is sufficient. She's been running the room for decades. She's seen everything. Her judgment is not negotiable. The door is either open or it isn't. The evening structure becomes its own kind of art. An ozashiki, a formal banquet entertainment, isn't. Dinner with a floor show. Keiseki food arrives in lacquerware bowls, clear soup with sea bream, grilled ayu sweet fish from the Kamo River, seasonal garnishes arranged like small architectural decisions, sake warms in ceramic tokuri flasks set in hot water, and the faint fermented grain smell drifts into the room before the first pour. The lighting stays deliberate. Many okiika resisted upgrading past gaslight. Even after electricity was available, the dimness isn't atmospheric accident. The room is doing something intentional. The room has preferences. The geisha herself arrives after the room is already arranged. You enter, you sit, you perform. The shamisen gets tuned, that high sharp plucking, silk strings pulled taut, and that sound is the audible signal that the evening has officially begun. You're not background music. You're not a hostess in the modern sense, which is a different profession that displaced yours in the 1950s and charged considerably less per hour. Your conversational intelligence is the product. You know the political climate, the artistic gossip, the correct thing to say when a client needs to feel clever without actually having said anything clever himself. This skill takes years. It doesn't appear on the invoice as a line item. It's just included in the incense. Meanwhile, the kenban is tracking all of it. Every senko dai, every engagement, every tea house that called for you specifically. The records are meticulous in the way only systems built around debt management tend to be, because the ozashiki fees aren't abstract income, they're repayment. The flower and willow debt from your training years is still running in the background, quietly compounding through ongoing costume costs, new shamisen strings, seasonal accessories the ledger insists are necessary. The incense burns down. Another stick is lit. The kenban notes the time. An ozashiki is not a venue anyone can simply walk into. A new client, someone who has never attended a given ochiya before, must be formally introduced by an existing patron in good standing. Not casually mentioned, not recommended in passing over drinks elsewhere. Formally introduced, in person, by someone whose financial record with the tea house is clean, and whose behaviour at previous engagements has been considered acceptable. The chaya isn't running a general screen for problematic personalities. It's maintaining a room where the experience depends entirely on who is in it when it's delivered. The door is the product. The door has always been the product. The door would like you to know it has standards. Here's what that actually looks like in practice. You don't book a table. There's no reservation system, no website, no wait list. You join by submitting your email address. The orchestrated, the tea house mother, knows who you are before you arrive because someone she already trusts has stood in front of her and said your name out loud, with their own reputation attached to the statement. It's the opposite of Yelp. It's the opposite of Open Table. It's closer to getting into a private members club where the application process is entirely conducted by someone who is not you. Now it gets personal. You're not being done a casual favour. Your introducing patron is extending a form of credit, their credit, secured against your future behaviour. If you drink until you're loud and ungracious, if you handle the lacquerware incorrectly, if you treat the geisha as something other than what she is, a trained professional in a formal engagement, not a prop, not a servant, not yours, your patron absorbs the consequence. Their standing takes the damage, which is a light way of describing what is, functionally, a social emergency delivered cold over tea at a later date. The orkia doesn't need to confront you directly. Your patron handles that, privately, in whatever uncomfortable conversation follows. The orchestrated hasn't raised her voice once. Now, once you've been introduced and you've attended an evening without incident, you're not automatically in. You're probationary. You come back. You demonstrate over several visits that you understand the room, that you can participate in the ozashiki games without making the geisha visibly tired, that you tip correctly and pay your kenban invoice without delay. Over time, you become a known quantity. The okiya starts to feel like somewhere you belong. The chrysanthemum arrangement in the tokonoma alcove looks correct to you now, which is not something you could have said 6 months ago, and isn't something the Akaya needed to point out. But meanwhile, a new client's first evening costs exactly the same as an established patron's. The senko-dai rate doesn't flex for inexperience. You're paying a skilled carpenter's weekly wage for a few hours, regardless of whether you understood half of what was happening. And there's a reasonable chance you didn't. The conversation moves fast, the games have rules nobody explains in advance, and the sake keeps arriving in warm ceramic tokery flasks before you've had a chance to assess how the last one treated you. Nobody is being unkind. You bow at the correct moment, approximately, and hope the room grades on a curve. It does not grade on a curve. The okiya has seen this before. You show up on time. You tip correctly. You request the same geisha by name across years, because she is the only person in the room who laughs at the right moment, and you have spent considerable money figuring that out. You have strong feelings about which lacquer cup is yours. The lacquer cup has strong feelings about being handled correctly. Eventually, the room simply folds around you and you stop noticing the seams. And if that changes, if the evenings stop arriving in your calendar without explanation, nobody calls, nobody writes. Your patron says nothing, and neither do you, and the evenings continue without you in them. The orchestrated files nothing. She simply remembers. Dance practice happens every day. Not most days, not when the schedule allows, every day with corrections. And the corrections are precise and immediate. The dominant tradition in Jeon Kobo is Inoue Ryu, founded in the early 19th century. And Inoue Ryu has positions for everything. Every angle of the wrist, every transfer of weight through the foot, every interval between movements has a correct form and a form that is not that. And anyone trained in the school can identify the wrong one from across the room in a single viewing. You practice until the correct form stops requiring conscious thought. This takes years. In the meantime, the corrections are daily, and the teacher is patient in the specific way that means she's not patient. Here's what the dance actually looks like. Inoue Ryu is not athletic in any sense you'd recognize from a YouTube dance tutorial. There's no large gesture for its own sake. The vocabulary is interior, a shift in the chin by 3 degrees, a sleeve lifted to a specific height and held there, a step so controlled it's less like walking and more like the floor is being consulted. The emotional content of the piece travels entirely through small choices. You don't leap, you don't spin, you suggest. Precisely, and the audience reads it. It's the opposite of a Marvel film, in that restraint is the point and nothing explodes. Now, the fan. The folding fan is not a prop in the theatrical sense, it's a vocabulary element. It stands in for a sword, a sake cup, rain, a letter, a glance across a room. You carry it open, closed, tilted, or at rest, and each position means something specific within the piece being performed. Dropping it is not an option the school acknowledges. Getting it wrong is an option the school documents carefully and returns to at the next session. The fan has opinions about your grip and communicates them through every rehearsal. Dance isn't the only art being drilled, though. Shamisen practice runs parallel, and the shamisen is its own ongoing disagreement between you and an instrument that costs several months of an ordinary worker's wages to build. The body is cat or dog skin stretched over red sandalwood, the strings are silk, and the sound when it's correctly played is sharp and bright, and slightly melancholy in the way that makes a room go quiet. Getting to that sound takes the same daily repetition as everything else. The instrument doesn't meet you halfway. It simply sits there, expensive and unimpressed, like a vintage Gibson guitar that you haven't earned yet. Here's the thing about the annual performances. They're legible as something other than a seasonal event. The Miyako Odori, the cherry blossom dance in Gion-Kobu, has run every spring since 1872, which means it's been going longer than the Eiffel Tower has existed, and considerably longer than anyone has cared about most things. Maiko and Geiko perform together in a staged program for ticketed audiences, and the level of polish required is such that daily practice becomes daily practice plus additional rehearsal as April approaches. The schedule doesn't expand to accommodate this. Everything else simply compresses around it. Meanwhile, the body is registering all of this. Okobo sandals add height and restrict the ankle. The kimono binds at the knee. The correct geisha gait. Small steps. Toes slightly inward. Weight transferred with deliberate control is aesthetically considered and physically demanding in the specific way of things that look effortless and aren't. By the time a maiko has her erikai ceremony and transitions to full geiko status, her posture and movement are so deeply ingrained they're essentially architectural. She doesn't stand like other people stand. The years of correction are visible in every room she enters. The teacher who wasn't patient got what she wanted. The shamisen is 3 strings, a skin drum body, and a neck, constructed from red sandalwood or mulberry wood, strung with silk, and traditionally skinned with cat or dog hide. A quality instrument costs the equivalent of several months of an ordinary craftsman's wages. You are expected to own one, maintain it, carry it visibly per the 1779 government mandate, and play it at a standard that justifies your billing rate. The shamisen produces a specific sound when played correctly, and a distinctly different sound when played incorrectly, and anyone in the room who has spent time in the hanamachi will know, within the first measure, exactly which version they are hearing. The instrument does not soften this information. Here's what you're actually holding. The body is a small hollow drum, roughly the size of a hardback book, and the skin pulled across it is the part that produces the distinctive resonant buzz, the sawari, that makes shami sound like nothing else. Cat hide produces a brighter tone. Dog hide is slightly warmer. Neither material is mentioned at dinner. The neck is long and unfretted, which means your left hand is entirely responsible for intonation without any hardware to assist it, which is the musical equivalent of being told to drive without lane markings, and also the car is on fire. Now, the technical demands. The barki, a flat plectrum shaped roughly like a large ginkgo leaf, strikes the skin as well as the strings simultaneously. You're not just playing notes. You're managing the percussive impact of each strike against the drum face, the pitch accuracy of each string stopped by the left hand, and the rhythmic precision of the overall line, all while sitting in formal seiza position on a tatami floor. This is not the same as learning guitar in a college dorm. There's no equivalent of a capo. The shamisen doesn't travel alone. Cases for transport are lacquered wood or wrapped cloth, and the instrument is carried in public as a professional identifier, which was the specific point of the 1779 mandate. The government wanted geisha visibly distinguishable from oiron, and carrying a shamisen case through the street accomplished this in the same way a badge does, except the badge costs several months of wages and requires daily tuning. The sharp plucking sound of strings being adjusted before a performance serves as a kind of unofficial announcement. The okaya knows something is about to begin. The sate gets warmed. Meanwhile, the instrument itself has opinions about weather. Skin-topped instruments are sensitive to humidity, temperature, and seasonal changes in ways that string players in more forgiving climates don't fully reckon with. Kyoto winters run 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in January. We're crossing stone-paved streets in a lightweight kimono, carrying an instrument that is already registering its displeasure about the cold. By the time you arrive and unwrap it, the skin may have shifted slightly in tension. Sol. Tension. You retune. You perform. The instrument has now charged you for the inconvenience via a replacement skin that costs what a week's groceries would, and the vocal repertoire that accompanies the shamisen is its own separate discipline. Nagauta, the long song tradition, requires breath control, precise tonal placement, and the ability to sustain phrases over rhythmic shamisen patterns without dropping pitch on the long notes. Think of it as the Celine Dion of the Edo period performance formats, except the training starts in childhood and nobody gives you a microphone. You develop the voice alongside the instrument for years before either is considered performance ready. The total cost of a single quality shamisen, its case a spare set of strings, and periodic reskinning across a career adds up to a figure that goes directly into your flower and willow debt without comment. The ledger records it. You keep playing after the food is cleared and the sake has been circulating long enough to matter. The games begin. Tora Tora, Compira Fune Fune, the various Ken hand game variants. These aren't idle activities slotted in to fill time. You run them the way an air traffic controller runs a runway, with total awareness of what's incoming, what's overdue, and which vessel is wobbling. The games set the pace. And you set the games, which means you're managing the energy of 6 slightly drunk men while performing the face of a woman who is simply delighted to be here. Your job is to run the games with what appears to be genuine enthusiasm, while monitoring whether the room is still at the correct temperature. You appear to simply be having fun. The room doesn't know you're working. You keep running the games. Tora Tora then first. It's a 3-player bluffing game involving a tiger, a grandmother, and a samurai. Each one defeats one of the others in a rotating logic that's essentially rock, paper, scissors, with more elaborate hand gestures and considerably more face. 2 players step behind a screen, choose their character simultaneously, then leap out and perform. The comedy comes from the mismatch, the banker performing grandmother while the district magistrate crouches, trying to look like a tiger. You've already seen this particular banker do the tiger pose 16 times this season. His commitment hasn't improved. You applaud anyway, because the applause is part of the mechanism, not the reaction. Compira Fune Fune involves a shrine, a rhythm, and a hand placed flat on a lacquered surface that neither player is supposed to let the other slap. You keep the song going. The other player has to match the pace. The drinking penalty for losing is small, a single tokari pour, warm, slightly sweet, but the stakes feel enormous to everyone involved, which is exactly the point. You've essentially turned a thimble of sake into a championship. The patrons are now competing with the seriousness of men who've forgotten they're at a dinner party. You keep singing. You keep pouring. You don't remind anyone that nothing is on the line, because the moment you do, the evening deflates like a ceremonial balloon and everyone remembers they have a commute. Now you're watching 6 people at once and none of them know it. You track who's laughing too hard, who's gone quiet, whether the quieter guest in the corner needs to be drawn in or left alone. Your face is the dashboard. The drinking song is the interface. You're also noting who's had enough sake to be charming and who's crossed into territory that'll embarrass him tomorrow, which is the same face, different eyebrows, and you've learned to read the difference. You don't intervene directly, Diane. You redirect. A new game, a refill, a joke that lands on someone else. The room never feels managed. You start a new round of Tora Tora. The games aren't all created equal. Some are warm-up games for early evening, others are reserved for when the room has loosened up enough to handle them. Deploying a high-energy Ken game at the wrong moment is like dropping a DJ drop into a eulogy. Technically the same genre, completely wrong room. You read the pacing the way a sommelier reads a table, except you're also the entertainment and the sommelier and the person who decides when to call last round. There's no modern job title for this. The business card would be too long, and nobody would believe it. The evening's energy has a shape, and you feel it in your body before the room does. It rises during the games, softens during the music, plateaus somewhere around the second hour when the best conversation happens, then begins its natural descent. You don't announce the descent. You don't slow the tempo or dim your expression or do anything that signals a conclusion is approaching. You simply start choosing shorter songs, lighter games, rounds with natural stopping points built in. The last game finishes. The last cup is poured. Somehow everyone already has their outer robes on, as if the room itself decided. You bow at the door. Your feet, inside the tightly bound kimono, have been aching for the last hour. Nobody sees that part. Knowing what to say, when to say it, and when to say nothing at all, is trained over years the same way dance is trained, and in the hanamachi it is valued roughly the same way. A senior geiko at a top-tier ozashiki is expected to hold genuine conversation with politicians, merchants, artists, and occasional foreign visitors to discuss poetry, current affairs, or sake production with someone who has been talking for decades and can distinguish between being actually listened to and being professionally managed. The gap is detectable. You learn to close it, which is a different and harder skill than simply having opinions. Now, the details. You're not performing interest. You're generating it from whatever material the guest brings. A bad joke, a half-formed opinion about rice futures, an anecdote about a business trip to Osaka that has already been told twice this evening. You receive this as though it's the first time. You respond with something that makes him feel specific and clever, without making him feel flattered, which he'd notice. The distinction between those two outcomes is approximately where the training lives. It's less like therapy, and more like the most demanding improv class you've never signed up for, except the audience has expense accounts and the show runs until someone decides it doesn't. Now, the hanamachi had a specific term for this category of skill. It fell broadly under the concept of zashiki, meaning banquet room conduct. You can play shamisen beautifully and then say the wrong thing at the wrong moment, and the room cools by approximately 3 degrees, and nobody touches their sake cup. The shamisen was what you were contracted to bring. The conversation was what they'd remember. These are not the same skill. You carry both into the room, and only one of them shows up on a program. The subjects weren't random, naturally. You'd need to know enough about no theatre to discuss it with someone who'd seen last week's performance, and enough about sake production regions to not embarrass yourself when a brewery owner launched into specifics. You'd know recent political events well enough to ask intelligent questions, and know which ones you wouldn't ask at all, which is, it turns out, most of them. There is a phrase for this skill set now. Several phrases, actually, and at least one corporate training module with a completion badge built over a 2-hour webinar rather than a decade of daily practice. The certificate was the room not going quiet. Here's where the seasonal awareness training compounded everything, mentioning the correct poetic association for the current month, referencing the right flower, the right classical allusion. These were signals that placed you in a specific cultural register that the guest recognized as rare. It's the equivalent of a dinner companion casually quoting the exact right passage from a book you love. You stop performing and start actually talking. That was the intended outcome. Getting there required knowing enough material across enough domains that the correct reference arrived naturally, not hunted down mid-sentence. Meanwhile, you were also tracking everyone else at the table simultaneously. Who needed another pour? Who'd gone quiet? And whether that was contentment or irritation, whether the senior guest's energy was dropping and the room needed reorienting before anyone noticed. The conversation was the foreground. The room management was still running underneath it, the same as it had been during the games, just quieter and harder to see. The tokery flask gets refilled. Nobody marks the moment it happened. Every evening you apply the oshiroi, the white foundation, starting at the neck and working upward, leaving the nape exposed in the characteristic V pattern that marks your stage of training in your district. The formula used through most of the 19th century contained white lead compounds. This was not a secret. It simply was not the primary concern of someone managing a debt ledger, a booking schedule, and the behavioral expectations of her house mother. Lead was doing the same cosmetic job that zinc oxide would eventually do more safely, and the 19th century had a general policy of not troubling itself with what would later be categorized as the problem. You remove it each night with camellia oil and rice bran, and apply it fresh the next evening. The application itself isn't quick. The oshiroi doesn't go on in 2 minutes, like a BB cream. It's built up in layers, each one pressed smooth with a damp brush, starting at the collar and moving up the jaw, across the forehead, down to the nose. You leave the V at the nape, sometimes a W shape during the maiko stage, because bare skin at the back of the neck is considered the most elegant thing your body currently has to offer. A maiko's nape gets more critical attention than most people's entire faces. The camellia oil goes on first as a base, so the oshiroi has something to adhere to. Without it, the lead formula would sit in your pores and stay there. The camellia oil is doing its best. The lead is not cooperating. The removal process is its own ritual. Rice bran in a cloth bag. Work gently across the face until the white lifts off in streaks that look vaguely like a kabuki mask in the process of dissolving. Then the camellia oil again, then warm water, then a check in the small mirror for anything the process missed. In Kyoto's winter, 3 to 5 degrees and stone-paved streets outside, you've just spent 40 minutes at a wash basin that's barely above freezing. Then the whole application starts again the next evening. It's the Sephora skincare routine's direct ancestor. Except the Sephora routine doesn't accumulate neurological damage with consistent use. Now, the zinc oxide transition happened gradually through the Meiji period and into the early 20th century as Western chemistry filtered into Japanese cosmetic manufacturing. Nobody issued a formal announcement that the previous formula had been quietly poisoning its users for roughly a century. The switch happened the way a lot of 19th century safety improvements happened, quietly, without acknowledgement, in the direction of a product that worked about as well and didn't require anyone to apologize. The lead-based oshiroi didn't retire with fanfare. It just wasn't reordered. The white foundation isn't where it ends. The lip color, a deep red called beni derived from safflower petals, goes on with a small brush applied in a deliberately reduced shape smaller than the actual lip line, which is considered more refined than filling the full mouth. Maiko paints only the lower lip during her first year, which gives her the expression of someone perpetually surprised by dessert. The red around the eyes comes from the same beni sauce, applied at the outer corners only. The eyebrows are blocked and redrawn higher on the forehead, in shapes that vary by house tradition. Every component has a rule. The rules have sub-rules. The sub-rules have historical precedents that predate your grandmother. and yet the whole effect, assembled under candlelight in a nokaya, takes about as long to read as a glance. The orchestrated across the room clocks your collar, your lip shape, your nape, lower lip only, V-cut narrow, first-year brows, and adjusts the seating arrangement accordingly. You haven't said anything yet. You haven't needed to. The nape handles the introduction. Getting dressed takes longer than the rest of your morning, every morning, because the kimono does not cooperate unassisted. A maiko furisode requires help to put on, involves specific layering in a specific order, and has the structural logic of a textile argument that you are not allowed to lose. The obasash communicates your district, your house, your career stage, and your legal status, simultaneously, through fabric, to anyone who knows how to read it. It is tied at the back. Not because the back is more comfortable, because the Tokugawa government required back-tied obis as the regulatory boundary between Geisha and Oiren in 1779, and the dress code has not renegotiated since. You are wearing your professional classification. This takes approximately 45 minutes. The furisode itself deserves a moment. A single special commission piece requires 4 to 6 weeks on a jacquard loom, which, to be clear, is the same loom technology that eventually inspired early computer punch card systems, so your sleeve is technically a relative of the IBM mainframe. The Nishijin silk district in Kyoto produced these, and a finished maiko furisode could cost the equivalent of an ordinary craftsman's annual wages. The fabric has opinions about how it's folded. You fold it correctly anyway, because the alternative is explaining yourself to your okia mother, and that conversation takes longer than the dressing. Now, the okobo sandals. Wooden platform sandals anywhere from 10 to 15 centimeters high, that the kimono and obi have already decided you'll be wearing before you had any input on the matter. The tightly bound kimono restricts your stride to something between a formal shuffle and what a penguin does when it's trying to look professional. This gait is considered aesthetically desirable. The sandals announce you on stone-paved streets before you arrive, which in January, when Kyoto drops to 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, means everyone in the Okiai district hears you coming through the cold from half a block away. You're not sneaking anywhere. The okobo have already told on you. Now, the layering math becomes interesting. Under the furisode sits the nagajuban, which is a full inner kimono. Under that, additional padding to shape the silhouette toward the flat-fronted ideal, because the aesthetic here doesn't negotiate with your actual body, it renegotiates your body's relationship with geometry. The sash, the collar, the sleeve cords, the date-jime binding layer, each item serves a function, and each function was decided by someone who has been dead for 200 years. It's less a wardrobe and more a committee decision rendered in silk, and yet the result is precise. The collar displays exactly how much white nape is visible from behind, the exposed V-shape you spent last night perfecting, because the back of the neck is the focal point of the entire presentation once you're dressed. Your face has the makeup. Your back has the collar. The obi has the classification data. You're a walking document, formally formatted, and the formatting took 45 minutes. A Nishijin weaver spent 6 weeks on your sleeves. The Tokugawa government spent 300 years on your sash placement. You spent camellia oil and rice bran on your face last night. Meanwhile, the shamisen case sits by the door. You'll carry it visibly, that's also regulatory, also 1779, also non-negotiable, 2SE. It's your professional credential made portable, the equivalent of a licensed contractor's truck signage, except considerably more expensive and significantly harder to parallel park. At some point in your career, the subject of a dana arises. A dana is a wealthy patron, a senior merchant, a politician, an industrialist, who agrees to sponsor your ongoing training and living costs in exchange for exclusive companionship and the social prestige that comes from association with a successful geiko. Your okia mother negotiates the arrangement. She meets with his people, the terms are discussed, and at no point does anyone write anything down. because the karyukai considers paperwork a mild insult to everyone present. You don't book a meeting, you don't attend the meeting. You are informed of the outcome, the way a building is informed that it now has a new owner. You are, in the language of a later century, the subject of a significant sponsorship arrangement in which the sponsor considers the word sponsorship to be missing something important. The Dana's role, stripped of its poetry, is financial. He covers the gap, the portion of your training costs, kimono commissions, and accessory expenses that your ozashiki earnings haven't yet reached. Given that training a single geiko from shikomi through erike costs somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in modern terms, that gap isn't trivial. He's less a romantic figure and more a walking line of credit with dinner reservations. The Okiya mother handles the negotiation with the precision of a mid-sized merger, and you're informed of the outcome. Now, what he receives in return isn't codified anywhere. It's understood. He gets your exclusive off-hours company, the right to host you at private dinners without booking through the kenban's formal fee structure, and the considerable social currency of being known as your Dana. In Meiji-era Kyoto, walking into a room as the patron of a top-tier Gion Geiko carried roughly the cultural weight of a named stadium sponsorship today, except the stadium has better posture and knows 300 classical dance forms. The word exclusive requires some precision here. The Dana doesn't appear on your appointment schedule. He doesn't interrupt ozashiki. He's more like a silent partner who occasionally becomes audible. Your public career continues intact. You still perform at tea houses, still rotate through patron lists managed by the kenban, still spend 45 minutes being dressed before you go anywhere. The Dana funds the infrastructure. The infrastructure belongs to the Okiya. You are not consulted on the ownership question, and the ownership question is not raised in your presence. The arrangement carried weight that didn't show up in any ledger. A Dana with political connections could open doors in hanamachi that pure artistic reputation couldn't. A Dana with declining finances could quietly destabilize an Okiya's entire season. So your Okiya mother sits across from a prospective Dana at a private dinner, watches him order, watches him tip, watches him say the name of the last geiko he sponsored and how that ended. She isn't charmed by charm. She's running a background check with better food. The sake is excellent. Her expression gives away nothing. Meanwhile, you didn't select at all. The 1872 Liberation Edict had nominally freed geisha from indentured arrangements, and the kashizashiki reclassification had just as nominally confirmed that nothing changed. Your Dana arrives with no contract, no job title, no formal paperwork of any kind, which, in modern terms, is the kind of arrangement that makes an accountant briefly leave the room. Modern HR wouldn't know where to file it. Besides, there's no folder for it. Someone would eventually create a folder, label it incorrectly, and put it in a drawer. The drawer stays closed. The system runs fine. The akobo are wooden platform sandals approximately 10 to 15 centimeters high, and you wear them through the stone streets of Gion in January, which is open-toed footwear in near-freezing temperatures, which is a choice the aesthetic tradition has made on your behalf. The kimono restricts your stride to something that could be described, generously, as an enthusiastic shuffle. The combination of constrained footwear and tightly bound lower layers produces a gait that is considered by the people observing it as graceful and aesthetically significant. Are you, producing it, in January, carrying a shamisen case? It is considered a commute. You become very good at it. The aesthetic admiration does not make the cold less specific. The kimono itself has opinions. A fur sewed for a maiko isn't an outfit. It's a structural decision made by 4 to 6 weeks on a jacquard loom, and the equivalent of a craftsman's annual salary. The Nishijin silk weighs more than you'd expect, drapes exactly as tradition requires, and communicates your precise professional status to anyone in Gion who knows how to read it, which is everyone in Gion. You don't get to pick it out like you're on ASOS. The Okiya selects it, the Okiya pays for it. The Okiya adds it to your ledger under the flower and willow debt column, where it joins your lessons, your accessories and your sandals, including the ones currently making your feet unreasonably cold. Now, the white makeup comes off every night with camellia oil and rice bran cleanser, which sounds like a Sephora exclusive and is actually just the practical solution to removing something applied with the structural commitment of a wall primer. Early formulations contained lead compounds, which the body absorbed with cheerful indifference to the consequences. Zinc oxide alternatives became standard in the 20th century. The switch was an improvement. Nobody framed it as an improvement at the time. They just quietly stopped using the lead version, the way you'd quietly stop doing something that was clearly a problem without officially acknowledging it had been a problem. The shamisen case becomes relevant here beyond its obvious function. The 1779 Tokugawa edict required you to carry it visibly, not tucked away, not bundled, because a geisha carrying a shamisen was a performer, and a performer wasn't a courtesan, and this visible distinction was the regulatory logic the authorities had settled on. Essentially a Tokugawa-era verified checkmark, except the platform was made of wood, and the consequences were legal. The shamisen is made from red sandalwood or mulberry, strung with silk and covered in cat or dog skin, and costs several months of a workingman's wages. It's heavy enough to matter when you're already navigating stone streets in platform sandals at 3 degrees Celsius. The edict doesn't mention the cold. The edict wasn't written by anyone who was outside in it. Meanwhile, the okaya, you're travelling between keeps, its lighting deliberately dim. Gas arrived in the 1880s, electricity came after that, and certain okaya acknowledged both developments with the minimum possible enthusiasm. The dim light is a preservation strategy, the way some restaurants still use paper menus not because they're better, but because the atmosphere has a position on the subject. The candles and low lamps soften the lacquerware, warm the colour of the tokuri flasks sitting in their hot water, and make the room feel continuous with some earlier version of itself. The room has been doing this for decades. The room is committed to the bit. You arrive. You remove the okobo at the entrance. Your feet, briefly, register something close to gratitude. The shama's case goes where it goes. The cold stays outside on the street, and the evening begins the way it always begins. Silk tuning strings pulled sharp in a quiet room, sake releasing its faint grain scent into the air. And somewhere in the ledger at the kenban office, tonight is already accounted for in incense stick units. The cold was part of the commute. This is the job. The Banki is a published critique, a ranking and commentary on geisha that has been circulating since the 18th century among clients and connoisseurs across the entertainment districts. It reviews your dance, your conversation, your social skill, your appearance, and your general professional standing based on assessments gathered from people who attended ozashiki and formed opinions afterward. You cannot opt out of the Banki. You cannot request a correction or a right of reply. The new edition sits on the okaya owner's desk by morning. She picks it up. She finds your entry. She reads it twice. The Banki isn't a casual review thread. It's a structured publication with categories, rankings and commentary, written in a register that's polite on the surface and absolutely precise underneath. You are evaluated on your dance technique, your shamisen playing, your conversational fluency, your appearance in makeup and kimono, and something harder to define that translates roughly as overall presence. Not one impression, a composite drawn from multiple ozashiki across a full season, the way a quarterly performance review would be, except the reviewers attended your parties and you served them tea. Each category sits next to your name in print. It's the Michelin guide, except what's being rated is you, and there's no appeals process. A patron named in the margins of last season's edition, the kind of man who considers himself a connoisseur of the karyukai, opens his copy at breakfast and runs a finger down the dance column until he finds you. He makes a small sound. He sets the book next to his tea. Later that afternoon he sends word to the okaya owner that he will not be requesting you for the autumn banquet after all. The okaya owner receives the message, nods once, and crosses your name off the draft invitation list. The flower and willow debt still running against your account at the kenban does not get smaller this week. The arm position matters. A slightly imprecise angle in the Inuryu tradition becomes a sentence in print, read by the same patron who saw it happen, and you practice the sequence again the next morning in a rehearsal room that smells like wood polish and old tatami. Your teacher corrects your wrist. She corrects it again. She corrects it a third time without saying anything, which is worse. You hold the position until your shoulder burns, because the next ozashiki is in 4 days and the patron from the margin note will be there. The hyobanki doesn't care about your effort. Nobody in the room mentions the addition by name. The commentary isn't always brutal, to be fair. A rising maiko approaching Erikai might receive language that acknowledges her promise, while carefully noting areas of development, which sounds encouraging, until you recognize that areas of development in a document, read by every patron in Gion, is still a public annotation on your professional standing. It's the equivalent of a LinkedIn recommendation that ends with "she's really growing into the role." The patron who wrote that recommendation attended your ozashiki twice last month. He will attend again next season. He will read the next edition before he books. A top-ranked geisha in Gionkobu carries that ranking visibly, and the okiar that hosts her makes sure you know it. The owner mentions the entry to an incoming patron before the tea is poured. Casually, the way someone mentions the weather. The patron nods. He books her for the following Thursday at a rate 12% higher than last season. The owner writes the new rate into the ledger without pausing. The new edition publishes. You read it before anyone else can tell you what it says. Then you go to rehearsal. The official government position is clear. Geisha sell artistic performance. Wairan sell sexual services. These are different professions with different legal statuses, different dress codes, different district registrations, and different regulatory frameworks. The practical reality of operating in the entertainment districts of Edo period Japan is that this distinction requires constant active maintenance from your end. The back-tied sash, the visible shamisen, the conduct at ozashiki that stays demonstrably within the parameters of artistic engagement. These are not merely professional habits. They are the daily performance of a legal category. Tonight's agenda is stay in the correct box, visibly, for several hours. The 1779 edict is where this gets specific. The Tokugawa government, having decided that the entertainment districts were getting confusingly crowded with overlapping professional categories, issued a set of regulations that attempted to draw hard distinctions in fabric and furniture. Geisha would tie their obi sash at the back. Oiran tied theirs at the front. Geisha would carry their shamisen visibly when travelling between engagements. These were compliance signals, the Edo period equivalent of wearing a government-issued lanyard, except the lanyard is a full silk sash and the compliance officer is someone who could revoke your professional standing. The shamisen case is not incidental. It's your credentials. You carry it where it can be seen. Now the sash distinction sounds like a minor wardrobe detail until you consider what it's actually encoding. The obi tied at the front was associated with women who expected it to be untied. The obi tied at the back required assistance to remove and signalled that untying was not the evening's agenda. The back-tied sash also paid better, which the sash is aware of. The sash has opinions about its own future and will hold its knot accordingly. You tie it correctly every morning, and every morning it sits there looking quietly certain about the kind of professional you are. The enforcement mechanism was the kenban, the district registry office that tracked your engagements, your earnings, and your professional conduct. If a complaint came in suggesting your performance had drifted outside the permitted category, the kenban heard about it. The kenban is basically a compliance department that also controls your scheduling and takes a percentage of your fees, which gives it the administrative personality of the IRS combined with a staffing agency. You don't argue with the kenban. You file correctly and show up on time. Meanwhile, the Oiran were operating under their own regulatory structure in the licensed pleasure districts, the Yoshiwara in Edo, the Shimabara in Kyoto, with their own elaborate hierarchies, their own dress codes, their own entrance fees and patron rituals. The distinction wasn't just legal, it was architectural. Geisha worked in Okaya in the hanamachi. Oiran worked in different buildings in different districts behind different gates. The geography was doing some of the work. You didn't accidentally end up in the wrong part of town. And yet the Western interpretation of all of this managed to flatten every distinction into a single convenient misunderstanding. Pierre Lotis' 1889 novel and Puccini's 1904 opera Madama Butterfly arrived with strong feelings and no apparent interest in obi-tying protocols or district registry paperwork. In the opera, your sash is tied incorrectly throughout the entire runtime. No one at the kenban files a report. The shamisen case does not appear in a single scene, not because it was lost, but because no one in the production knew it was supposed to be there, which is the kind of research outcome that has a specific smell to it. The practical burden of maintaining the distinction falls on you in small ways all evening. The way you enter a room, the angle at which you pour sake, the conversational register you maintain when a patron pushes toward familiarity that would read, to any observer, as a category violation. You're not just performing for the guests. You're performing for the room itself, for anyone watching who might have an opinion worth writing down in a hyobanki. The distinction isn't something you establish once. It's something you re-establish every time you walk through a door. Japan is modernizing in the Meiji period, and modernizing means something specific. You feel it first as paperwork. A Western-style census form arrives at the okiya, and someone has to decide which box the okiya goes in. Official functions now require Western dress, which means someone at those functions is standing next to someone in a frock coat, explaining, in careful language, what the hanamachi is. Every institution that seemed permanent under the Tokugawa is now on a list somewhere. The hanamachi isn't abolished, but it's on the list. Foreign visitors arrive with opinions already formed. Newspapers form additional opinions, mostly without visiting. Government reformers form structured opinions with policy implications and, occasionally, acronyms. You're running a career in a world that's rewriting its own rules in real time, and the new rules were written by people who have not attended a single ozashiki. You've been practicing art for decades. Now a committee wants to know if it qualifies. The 1872 Geisha and Prostitute Liberation Edict arrives and nominally frees every indentured geisha in Japan. On paper, the debt is cleared. The contract is dissolved. You're free. In practice, the government immediately introduces the ozashiki reclassification system, which allows okiya to reframe the same arrangement under different legal language and continue operating without meaningful interruption. This is the legislative equivalent of a terms of service update, technically a change, functionally identical, and nobody asks if you read it. New paperwork arrives. You sign it. The okiya files it. Everyone moves on. Now the Meiji government is also very interested in tourism. Western dignitaries visit Kyoto. Trade delegations arrive. The hanamachi districts, which had spent 2 centuries carefully restricting access through introduction-only protocols, find themselves in the strange position of being part of the national welcome package. On Tuesday, a government report describes the hanamachi as a social concern requiring regulatory attention. On Wednesday, a trade delegation is handed an itinerary that includes Gion. You are on the Tuesday report as a problem to be managed. You are on the Wednesday itinerary as an attraction. Neither document mentions the other one exists. The Meiji period does something specific to the okiya. Gas lighting arrives in the 1880s. Electric light follows in the early 20th century. The rooms don't change. The lacquerware is still lacquerware. The tatami is still tatami. The tokuri still sits in its hot water bath, releasing that faint grain and warmth smell. But the lighting question becomes a deliberate aesthetic choice now. Many akaya keep the lamps dim on purpose. Modernity is available. They just don't switch it on all the way. The darkness is a position. Pusui fro to was Ted. Meanwhile, the Miyako Odori, the cherry blossom dance staged annually in Gyeonkobu, launches in 1872, the same year as the Liberation Edict. The timing isn't ironic by design. It's just a fact that sits there. The dance program is a public-facing showcase of Inoue-ryu classical technique, drawing Kyoto residents and foreign observers alike into the hanamachi on formal, visible, socially legible terms. You're not hidden behind an introduction protocol on those days. You're on a stage. The audience is large. The audience watches. The hanamachi does not follow up with a pamphlet. The reality: foreign observers mostly don't process the argument. Pierre Loti's novel from 1889 and Puccini's opera from 1904 have already distributed a different version of you to about 40 countries simultaneously, and that version doesn't require a response to correct itself. It's the Wikipedia entry that keeps getting re-vandalized faster than anyone can fix it. The Meiji government is worried about Western respectability. Western audiences have already decided what they think. Neither of them sends a representative to ask what you are doing on Wednesday. What you're still doing through all of this is working. January in Kyoto runs between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius. You're moving between okiya in lightweight kimono, shamisen case in hand, on stone-paved streets that don't retain heat. The okubo sandals keep the hem of the kimono off the ground and produce that specific constrained gait that centuries of aesthetic theory have decided is graceful. Cold is present, graceful is also present. Both of these things are simultaneously true every single evening, and neither the edict nor the editorial has anything useful to say about that. In 1872, the Meiji government issued the Geisha and Prostitute Liberation Edict, which formally freed all indentured entertainers from their contracts. In practice, the system reclassified existing arrangements under a new framework called ozashiki, which preserved the debt structure, the okiya relationship, and the contractual terms under updated administrative language. You had been nominally freed, but freedom required somewhere to go, resources to go there with, and a life outside the okiya system that years of training had not provided the opportunity to build. The edict freed you. The debt remained. Nobody informed the debt. The specifics: every lesson since shikomi stage was entered into the ledger. Every kimono, every accessory, every obi, every pair of okobo sandals recorded. The camellia oil and rice bran used to remove your makeup each night recorded. A single fur-isode for a maiko cost the equivalent of a craftsman's annual salary, and it wasn't a gift. It was an advance. The flower and willow debt was less a financial instrument and more a subscription service you'd been enrolled in at age 5 without reading the terms. The ozashiki reclassification didn't rewrite the ledger. It relabeled the column headers. The kenban still tracked your performances. The okeya still routed your fees through the same channels. The arrangement still functioned as it had, just with updated administrative language filed at a government office that was in any case not checking. What changed was the paperwork. The same way a company might rebrand its unpaid internship program as a talent development pathway. You don't get a meeting with the new manager. You get a revised document with the same numbers in smaller font. Freedom requires options. The options available to a geisha leaving the okiya in 1872 were limited in ways the edict's authors either didn't consider or considered and filed away. You'd spent years training in Inoue-ryu dance, shamisen, and ozashiki conversation. These skills were not transferable to factory work or domestic service. The Meiji economy was modernizing rapidly. There were new industries, new institutions, Western-style offices opening in cities. None of them were hiring women fluent in tora and classical fan technique. You update your profile. The employers are looking for something else. Nobody sends a rejection. You simply don't hear back. Some geisha did leave, though. A small number found Dana patrons willing to establish them independently, which solved the debt problem by replacing it with a different arrangement. A smaller number still managed to exit the system entirely, usually through marriage to a patron of sufficient means. These cases existed. They were not common. The edict was filed. The office closed for the evening. Somewhere across the city, A new shikomi arrived with her belongings, and the oka-san opened the ledger to a fresh page. Meanwhile, the okiya continued operating. The debt continued accumulating for new girls entering training. The shikomi stage still began between ages 4 and 10. The minarai and maiko stages still followed the same sequence. The erike ceremony still turned the collar from red and white to plain white, still marked the transition to full geisha status, still meant the debt had grown considerably larger over the course of the training. A top-tier Gion geisha by the mid-Meiji period might charge the equivalent of a skilled carpenter's weekly wage for a single evening, which sounds like excellent earning potential, until you look at what portion of that fee moved through the kenban and the okaya before it reached you, and how much of what reached you went directly toward the outstanding balance in the ledger. The debt was patient. It had no opinion about edicts. Pia Lotti spent time in Japan in the 1880s and published a novel, Madame Chrysantheme, in 1889. Puccini staged Madame a Butterfly in 1904. Between them, these two works established a portrait of what you are: passive, romantic, decorative, emotionally available, ultimately disposable, that circulated through Western cultural output for the next century with considerable confidence. You have spent years developing classical dance technique, shamisen proficiency, conversational intelligence, and the specific social skills required to manage sophisticated clients in high-pressure professional environments. The opera calls you a butterfly. The opera sold out across Europe. International press continues to use the butterfly framing while describing an institution that has been professionally training artists since the 1750s. Now, the details of what Lotti actually wrote: he arrived in Japan, hired a temporary local wife under a short-term residential contract, and treated the arrangement as a charming cultural souvenir worth dramatizing at length. The woman in the novel is gentle, decorative, and vaguely bewildered by the French officer's emotional complexity. She has no inner life the narrative finds interesting. The book became enormously popular in Europe, which is to say, enormously popular among people who had never been to Japan, were not planning to go, and preferred it that way. It's the 19th century equivalent of a travel blogger producing authoritative content after a 2-week visa, except the travel blogger did not inspire an internationally touring opera. Puccini took Lotti's general framework, added an American naval officer, and increased the tragedy quotient significantly. Tio Senda, protagonist of Madame a Butterfly, waits faithfully for a man who has already married someone else, and eventually dies for the honor of it. She's 15 years old at the start of the opera. The production design leaned heavily on cherry blossoms, silk, and a musical vocabulary that European audiences recognized as generically Eastern without it being specifically anything. It ran for decades. It still runs. Nobody asked you. Here's where it gets recursive. Western journalists arriving in Japan after 1904 already knew what you were before they spoke to anyone. They had a template. The template required tragedy, passivity, and a Western gaze that you were supposed to find illuminating. The template arrived before they did, checked in, and arranged the furniture. Arthur Golden's 1997 novel Memoirs of a Geisha, the one that led to a lawsuit from the actual highest-earning geisha in Gion-Kobu, Mineko Iwasaki, who had cooperated with his research, ran to the same pattern, updated for a contemporary readership, and adapted into a film where the lead roles were played by Chinese actresses. That particular detail was not well received in Japan. The template at this point had filed paperwork and acquired tenure. Meanwhile, what you actually do on a professional evening, you manage the energy of a room of senior businessmen or government officials who are paying the equivalent of a skilled carpenter's weekly wage for your presence. You direct drinking games, moderate conversation, perform classical pieces requiring years of dedicated study, and navigate the social hierarchies of a group of people who can't be seen to lose face in front of each other. You do all of this while wearing a kimono that limits your range of motion to something a penguin would find relatable on a schedule coordinated through the kenban in an ochiya you can only enter because someone vouched for you. The butterfly framing doesn't survive contact with the actual job description. The Western portrait kept circulating naturally. No language study required. No familiarity with Inuiru dance traditions. No understanding of the ozashiki format, or the kenban system, or the specific economics of the flower and willow debt. Just the opera. Just the blossoms. Just a woman in silk who exists to be moved by the presence of someone from elsewhere. There is a word for this. Several words, actually, and at least one of them has a Wikipedia page with 17 citations. The opera continues to sell out. The blossoms continue to blossom. The kenban continues to coordinate a professional scheduling system that has been running since before most Western nation-states had indoor plumbing. The miyako odori has been performed every spring in Gion-Kobu since 1872, and preparing for it begins weeks before any audience sees anything. The choreography is set by the Innu school. Every active geiko and maiko in the district performs together, which means you're not an ensemble in the casual sense. You're a coordinated system of people who have trained in the same tradition since childhood and will be judged as a single unit. Rehearsals are daily. Costumes are coordinated across the company. The performance isn't an opportunity to interpret the material. It's an opportunity to execute the material precisely in front of an audience that has attended previous years and will notice any deviation. You rehearse until noticing a deviation becomes structurally impossible. The specifics. The Inuiru tradition doesn't hand you a syllabus and wish you luck. It hands you a body of movement that has been codified since the early 19th century, with gestural vocabulary specific enough that the position of a single finger has a correct and incorrect version. You've been training in this tradition since shikomi stage, which means years of physical correction before you were permitted anywhere near a stage. By the time miyako odori rehearsals begin, you're not learning the choreography. You're stress testing your retention of it. The difference is subtle. The consequences aren't. Now, the event itself. April. The Gion-Kobu Kaburenjo Theatre fills with ticketed audiences for multiple performances across the month. It's essentially a Broadway run, except the cast has been performing together their entire professional lives, and nobody is understudying anything. Tourists attend. Long-standing patrons attend. Foreign dignitaries have attended. The experience includes a formal tea service before the performance, which is the miyako odori's version of a Michelin-starred restaurant giving you bread while you wait. Nice gesture. Not the point. The point is what happens on the stage. The production moves through a series of scenes, each depicting a seasonal mood, a classical poem, or a segment from traditional narrative. You're in the third scene when you feel it. The kimono for this sequence was purpose-made for miyako odori, not pulled from regular rotation, and a single maiko's performance kimono represents weeks of labour from Nishijin's silk weavers, which is the textile equivalent of filing a formal complaint in advance about your posture. Colours shift between scenes. Costumes are matched across every performer on the stage, which means someone upstream coordinated all of this before you arrived, and that someone had a spreadsheet. The fabric has an opinion about your posture. You adjust accordingly. The kimono doesn't adjust. The kimono has already decided. The Tokugawa odori in Pontocho has run since 1872 as well. Same founding year. Different district, different choreographic tradition, different character entirely. In Pontocho, you're in a narrower alley, a shorter walk, a theatre that seats fewer people, and feels like it knows all of them personally. The performances run warmer, slightly less formal. The theatre is essentially a very elegant corridor, and the corridor is doing its best. Attending both in the same spring and comparing them is basically the geisha equivalent of doing a side-by-side tasting, except the sommelier has been practicing since childhood, and you're the one being evaluated. Meanwhile, the revenue implications of miyako odori aren't incidental. Ticket sales, tea ceremony fees, souvenir programs, and the general tourism surge it anchors into April make this the hanamachi's highest earning month. You feel it too. Your schedule fills. The orchia you're affiliated with runs at capacity, and the patrons who come for the odori want the full experience. Theatre in the afternoon, ozashiki in the evening. You are, in practical terms, both the performance and the follow-up meeting. The Meiji government originally funded it to impress Western visitors in 1872. It's now 153 years later. The theatre is still full, the souvenir programs sell steadily out front, and the visitors have changed approximately as much as the scheduling has, which is to say, not at all. Your career is, incidentally, keeping several other industries operational. You wear the evidence. The nishijin weavers who produce your kimono fabric, the shamisen makers who build and maintain your instrument, the hairpin workshops, the lacquerware craftsmen supplying the orchia's table service. You are the reason all of them have a Tuesday. A single maiko kimono wardrobe requires months of skilled loom work. A performance-grade shamisen requires specialist construction. Training one maiko from shikomi through erike costs the modern equivalent of $500,000 to $1 million. The weavers have opinions about your career trajectory. They don't share them, but they have them. The shamisen deserves a closer look. It's not a simple instrument. The body is built from red sandalwood or mulberry wood. The neck is jointed for disassembly, and the resonating membrane is traditionally stretched cat or dog skin, a material choice that kept certain workshops occupied and also, presumably, made the instrument the most unsettling thing to explain at customs. A performance-grade shamisen costs several months of a working craftsman's wages. It requires tuning before every session, maintenance after every performance, and periodic reskinning. Your instrument has an ongoing maintenance relationship with its maker, the way a Formula One car has a relationship with its pit crew, except quieter and with better table manners. Now, the Nishijin district of Kyoto has been producing silk textiles since the 15th century, and it's not subtle about being good at it. A special commission fur-sewed kimono for you can require 4 to 6 weeks on a jacquard loom, the same jacquard loom system that eventually influenced punch card computing, which means there's a direct line from your sleeve to the early history of IBM, and nobody mentions this at dinner. Like, the fabric arrives dyed in patterns that take longer to name than most people spend on breakfast. A single garment costs the equivalent of a year's ordinary wages. You wear it for an ozashiki. You wear it walking through stone-paved streets in January cold at 3 degrees Celsius. The kimono doesn't comment on any of this. It simply resists. And yet the economics run in both directions. You show up, you get hired, the yokai keeps ordering, and somewhere across the city, a lacquerware workshop fills another commission. When you walk into an ozashiki, you are also keeping the camellia oil supplier's invoice paid, the tatami supplier's delivery schedule intact, and the ceramic takuri flask workshop in a position to make next month's rent. Beidou. By the time Japan's geisha population peaked at roughly 80,000 registered geisha nationwide in 1928, those workshops were not small operations. They were industries. When your numbers fell, a lacquerware craftsman looked at his order book and found a shorter list than the year before. The bowl cost the same to make. It just sat on fewer tables. By 2020, your population, the working geisha concentrated almost entirely in Kyoto's 5 hanamachi, had fallen to somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. That's roughly the seating capacity of a mid-sized concert venue. And you are sustaining a supply chain that once supported a national industry. The Nishijin district has diversified. Scarves, neckties, upholstery, occasional collaborations with fashion labels, the way a legacy restaurant pivots to catering. But the commissioned kimono work, the performance-grade instrument orders, the full traditional supply chain, that depends on you still showing up, still performing, still giving the hanamachi a reason to keep ordering the real thing. The hairpin workshops know this. The shamisen makers know this. The lacquerware craftsmen loading bowls into okiya kitchens for the evening kaiseki service know this. Nobody says it out loud during dinner. The soup arrives hot, the ayu sweet fish is garnished correctly, and the silk strings are already tuned. In Kyoto, in January, it is 3 to 5 degrees Celsius, and your booking schedule does not adjust for weather. You travel between okaya on foot, carrying your shamisen case, in a kimono that has not been designed with insulation as a priority, through stone-paved streets in open-toed okobo. There is no other logistical option. The distance between tea houses is not large. The problem is the gap between leaving one okaya looking composed and arriving at the next one still looking composed, which is a narrow operational window that the January air does not assist with. You have approximately 1 block to accomplish this transition. Over a season, you become very good at the block. What 3 engagements in a single January evening actually looks like. Your first ozashiki starts at 6. You're there by 5:50, which means you left the okiya at 5:40, which means the cold has had exactly 10 minutes to register an opinion about your collar. Mold, ku-tu. The okobo add 4 inches of height and restrict your stride to something between a walk and a controlled negotiation with gravity. The kimono holds your silhouette in place, regardless of your personal feelings about the temperature. You arrive. You look composed. The room is warm. Sake is warming in ceramic tokiri flasks set in hot water, and the faint fermented grain smell meets you at the door like a much more comfortable acquaintance. Now the second engagement is at 8:30, across the district, in a room you've worked maybe a dozen times. You know the patron. You know which ozashiki games he prefers, which songs land, and at what point in the evening someone will suggest compere fune and expect you to lose gracefully. You don't lose. You never lose. But you perform the possibility of losing, which is its own skill entirely, and one that doesn't appear in any training curriculum but absolutely should. You read the room. You decide what the room needs. You give it that, minus the actual loss. The third engagement starts at 10. By this point, the January streets have settled into their full operating temperature, which is unambiguous. You've reapplied nothing. The white makeup was set hours ago with camellia oil and rice bran preparation, and it holds. It's less a cosmetic choice at this hour, and more a structural commitment. Your shamisen case, which you've been carrying between venues all evening, has developed a personality. It doesn't complain. It simply exists with increasing presence, like a very quiet co-worker who's been ignored at 3 consecutive meetings. The kenban has logged all of this. Every engagement, every fee calculated in senkodai units, the incense stick pricing that measures your evening in slow combustion increments, recorded against your name in the district registry. Think of it as a Uber surge pricing model, except the surge never turns off, and you can't rate your passenger. A top-tier Geisha in this era is charging the equivalent of a skilled carpenter's weekly wage for a single evening's company. You've worked 3 of those evenings tonight. The math is favourable. The net earnings after okiya expenses, costume maintenance, and the slow arithmetic of the flower and willow debt are somewhat less favourable. The debt doesn't take the night off because the temperature dropped. You arrive at the third okaya. The room is candle-lit at the edges, electric light kept deliberately dim the way these older establishments prefer. The gaslight era came and went. Someone in a back office made a decision, and the candles stayed. The candles have opinions about this, and are very smug about it. You set down the shamisen case. You straighten your collar. The room doesn't know about the block, or the cold, or the 3 venues, or the weight of the case. The room just sees you arrive. In 1944, under the National Mobilization Law, geisha entertainment stops. Not declines, not reduces. Stops. The government needs labour for the war effort, and private banquet performance doesn't qualify as essential production. The hanamachi, which has operated in some form for nearly 2 centuries, goes quiet. Geisha take up work in factories and textile facilities. Okiya close or hollow out. The kenban ledgers stop accumulating entries because there's nothing to record. You're not abolished. The institution isn't abolished. It's suspended. And in the hanamachi's accounting, suspended means every existing debt stays on the ledger while no income is arriving to address it. The pause isn't free. Suspended actually means something specific here. The okiya lock their doors. The lacquerware is packed away. The nishijin silk kimonos get folded into storage chests, where they'll either survive the war or they won't. A significant number don't, because Allied bombing and wartime fire aren't particularly careful around textile collections. The shamisen cases go into corners. The senko dai pricing structure, the kenban registration, the dano arrangements, all of it stops mid-sentence the way a spreadsheet freezes when the server goes down, except the spreadsheet in question is your debt record, and it doesn't unfreeze clean. Now, the factories. You're reassigned to textile production or light manufacturing, which is at minimum ironic given that your entire working life has been organized around the production of luxury textiles you were never permitted to own outright. The furisode kimonos and the nishijin brocade obi stay in storage while you work, with industrial looms producing material for a different purpose entirely. Skills don't transfer. The hours are different. The social architecture that made your world function, the okesan, the okeya mistress, the kenban clerk, the dana, isn't present in a munitions-adjacent facility you manage. It's less structured than a modern HOA, which is saying something given how structured everything was before. Meanwhile, the physical hanamachi itself takes damage. Kyoto is largely spared from the worst bombing, a decision that was, depending on which historian you ask, either cultural sensitivity or strategic calculation. But either way, the city survives in better condition than Osaka or Tokyo. The stone-paved streets of Ponta-cho are still there. The wooden riverside tea houses are still there. What's gone is the population that made them function, scattered into war, work and evacuation and simple economic collapse. An empty okiya isn't a building waiting patiently. It's a building actively deteriorating without maintenance income, which is basically the building equivalent of ignoring a check engine light for a year and a half. The debt doesn't care about any of this. The flower and willow debt, every lesson, every kimono commission, every accessory purchased against future earnings, sits in the ledger like a guest who won't leave after the party's over. No performance fees are arriving. No senko dai units are being logged. The debt total doesn't grow new line items, but it doesn't shrink either. You're in the financial position of someone who's paused their Netflix subscription, but still owes the original credit card balance. The pause costs nothing extra. It also solves nothing. Japan surrenders in August 1945. The hanamachi begins, slowly and unevenly, to reopen. Some okiya reconstitute, some don't. The orchestrated is gone. The building was sold. The girls dispersed permanently into other lives. The kenban starts accepting registrations again. The okeya relights its lamps. The shamisen comes out of the corner. The ledger reopens, it picks up exactly where it left off. Japan surrenders in August 1945, and within months, the hanamachi begins the process of reconstituting itself. This is not a simple process. The war scattered the okiya networks, interrupted the training pipeline at multiple stages, and dispersed geisha into other professions for over a year. The women who had active careers before 1944 are returning to a profession that needs to simultaneously rebuild its client base, reassemble its institutional relationships, resume the kenban's administrative functions, and restart the training pipeline for junior practitioners all at once, without a formal reopening, because the hanamachi does not hold ceremonies for its own resumption of operations. It simply goes back to work and updates the ledgers. In practice, going back to work actually involves quite a lot. You spent 18 months doing factory shift work, and now you return to an okiya that survived the war largely intact but has no active clients on the schedule and a training roster that stopped mid-process. The minarai who is 6 months from her erike ceremony is now 2 years older and needs to be reassessed. The shamisen you left behind is slightly warped from storage. It has opinions about the last year and a half, and none of them are positive. The kimono that weren't sold to cover okiya costs during the suspension need airing, inspection and repair. Nishijin silk does not appreciate being folded for 18 months which is basically the textile equivalent of returning from a work trip to find your houseplants have filed a grievance. Nobody announces a grand reopening. The okiya simply starts accepting inquiries again and refers them back to the kenban, which reopens its registry and begins tracking engagements like it paused mid-sentence and is now continuing the same paragraph. Now the client side of this reconstitution is its own particular problem. The men who patronized the hanamachi before 1944 are not all available to resume that patronage. Some didn't survive the war. Some survived but are navigating personal financial collapse in a country whose economy had been redirected entirely toward a war effort that failed, which is the polite way of saying the savings are gone, the connections are gone, and the wardrobe suitable for an ozashiki is now someone else's curtains. The dana system, which required a patron to absorb enormous ongoing costs in exchange for exclusive company, needs participants with significant disposable income, and 1945 Japan is not producing those at volume. You note the gaps in the ledger. You do not comment on them. The okiya blinks first. It always does. Meanwhile, the Americans are present. The Allied occupation brings a new category of well-funded visitor to Japan, and some of them find their way into the hanamachi through introductions that are, by pre-war standards, unconventional. An American officer with no existing patron relationship and no knowledge of the introduction protocol is, institutionally speaking, a problem the ochiya doesn't have a procedure for. Some okiya accommodate it anyway, because accommodation keeps the lights on. The kenban notes the engagement, updates the ledger, and the system continues. It's the administrative equivalent of a restaurant quietly adding items to the menu that aren't printed on the card. The occupation also brings its own layer of misrepresentation. American servicemen encountering geisha for the first time in 1945 and 1946 arrive, having absorbed whatever cultural information was available to them, which is roughly the same pipeline that produced Madama Butterfly. The gap between what they expect and what an ozashiki actually involves, formal dance, practiced conversation, very warm sake, a specific and well-rehearsed social performance that takes years to learn and approximately 4 minutes to be misunderstood, is wide enough to be its own operational hazard. The hanamachi absorbs this too, without comment. The way it absorbs most inconveniences. You adjust your obi, you tune the shamisen, and you continue. Ayo. By the late 1940s, the training pipeline is running again, if thinner than before. You are entering shikomi stage now, inheriting a profession that has survived factory conscription and occupation, and is currently figuring out what it's worth in a country rebuilding from rubble. The flower and willow debt ledger, which held steady through the entire suspension, has resumed accumulating entries. Lessons, kimono, accessories, the arithmetic. By the 1950s and into the 1960s, a hostess bar has opened 3 streets over from the okiya. You've heard about it. Everyone has. A man you recognize, a merchant, previously a reliable quarterly client, the kind who always tipped correctly and knew how to sit, walks past the okiya entrance without stopping. You see him through the paper screen. He's heading in the direction of the hostess bar. He doesn't look back. His introduction is still on file. It took 4 months to arrange. The Oka-san watches the door for another moment, then returns to her ledger. The Senko dai rate is going up next month. It goes up. 3 months later, it goes up again. The Senko dai invoice goes to the kenban on schedule in the usual format with the usual column entries. At the hostess bar, a man named Kato, no introduction, no vetting, no prior engagements on record anywhere, sits down and has a pleasant evening. At your tea house, a man named Kato would be an open question the Okasan is still considering. The answer isn't no. It's not yes yet either. Kato ordered the chicken at the hostess bar and was home by 10. He left a tip. He's going back next week. Meanwhile, there's a girl in Kyoto in 1958 who would have gone to the okiya at age 7, the way her older cousin did in 1932, except there's now a textile factory 2 kilometers away that's hiring and pays weekly. She takes the factory job. At the factory, you clock in, you clock out, and nobody grades your posture. The factory doesn't require her to carry a shamisen through January streets in open-toed wooden sandals, a commute that the sandals have strong feelings about and express them constantly. The okia notes the vacancy. The shikomi roster gets shorter. By 1928, there were somewhere near 80,000 registered geisha. The current number is on a placard at a cultural heritage exhibit, next to a laminated map and a donation box that gets emptied twice a week. The woman at the hostess bar hasn't spent 15 years mastering Inoue-ryu dance. She can't play shamisen in 3 tunings without pausing to think. She can't navigate a kaiseki dinner conversation with a cabinet minister without someone at the table wincing slightly. Your okasan knows this. Your okasan is also watching the quarterly booking numbers, and the quarterly booking numbers have started to develop a personality, irritable, mostly, with a pessimistic outlook and no interest in improvement. The shamisen sits tuned and ready in its case. Tonight's client arrives at the appointed time, correctly introduced, and sits down. The incense burns. The senko dai rate goes up again the following spring. The orchestrated notes it in the ledger with the same handwriting she uses for everything. Across the city, an okaya that was taking bookings last year isn't taking bookings this year. Nobody announces this. The kenban stops routing engagements to that address, and the kenban's handwriting doesn't change either. You are Minako Iwasaki. You were adopted into the Iwasaki Okiya at age 3.5, trained in Gionkobu through the full pipeline, and by your mid-20s you are the highest-earning geisha in the most prestigious hanamachi in Japan, which places you, by the Karyukai's internal accounting, approximately at the top of the entire institution. In 1974, you host the Prince of Wales. Your schedule is full. Your reputation is established. Then in 1997, an American author named Arthur Golden publishes Memoirs of a Geisha, draws substantially on interviews he conducted with you, and characterizes the nature of your profession in terms you consider inaccurate and damaging. You file a lawsuit. It settles. The book continues to sell. The specifics. Golden interviewed you in the early 1990s, conducted research, and published a novel narrated by a fictional geisha who is trafficked, sexually exploited, and sold at auction to the highest bidder. The book is a bestseller. It wins awards. It gets a film adaptation. It's the Da Vinci Code of Japanese cultural misrepresentation, entirely confident, enormously popular, and built on a foundation that the people it depicts find somewhere between bewildering and insulting. Golden thanked you by name in the acknowledgements, which is how the public connected you to the fictional content. You hadn't agreed to that. The specific objection isn't abstract. You spent your career mastering Inu-ri dance, shamisen, and the conversational architecture of the ozashiki. This took years. Since 1779, there has been a formal registration system, an edict, a legal record, 2 centuries of paperwork, specifically built to draw a line between your profession and a different one. You carry none of this paperwork on your person, but the Karyukai carries it for you, and they feel strongly about where the line is. The novel's protagonist spends her career being auctioned to the highest bidder. Your career involves being the highest earning practitioner of a formally licensed art tradition in its most prestigious district. The acknowledgements page thanked you by name and left the distinction as an exercise for the reader. Pierlotti sits down in 1889 and writes Madame Chrysantheme, in which a Japanese woman stands in a doorway waiting for a European man to arrive and give her a plot. She has no plans of her own. The novel doesn't ask. Puccini borrows the doorway wholesale for Madame a Butterfly in 1904, adds an orchestra, and ships it to every opera house on earth. By 1997, that doorway has been standing open for 108 years. Golden walks through it carrying a manuscript with your name in the acknowledgements. The doorway gets a film adaptation. It also gets a gift shop tote bag. The lawsuit alleged breach of contract and invasion of privacy. It settled in 2003 for an undisclosed amount. The terms weren't published. Golden's acknowledgements were quietly removed from some subsequent editions. The book remained on bestseller lists for years, and its film version was released in 2005, directed by Rob Marshall, with a cast that managed the additional achievement of casting Chinese actresses in the lead roles of Japanese characters, which produced its own separate controversy in 2 countries simultaneously. You published your own memoir in 2002, Geisha of Gion, written with Randé Brown. It sold respectably. It described the actual training pipeline, the debt structure, the artistic demands, and what a career in Gyeongkobu looked like from the inside, including the parts that were genuinely hard, the physical discipline, the financial constraints, the years of shikomi stage work before anyone called you anything other than an apprentice servant. You retired from the profession in 1980 at age 29, partly because the physical and scheduling demands of being the institution's top earner had become, in your own accounting, unsustainable. The kenban doesn't give you weekends off. There is no kenban equivalent of a personal day. The kenban has never heard of a personal day and would like you to stop bringing it up. What you'd hosted in 1974 wasn't a diplomatic transaction dressed up as entertainment. To attend an ozashiki, the Prince of Wales needed someone the Okosan trusted to vouch for him. A name, spoken aloud by someone already inside the system. You don't book this on a website. You don't book it at all, technically. You are invited because someone credible said your name in the right room, and that process has been running without a customer service line since 1779. 23 years after you hosted the Prince of Wales, you filed a lawsuit. The novel it described had been collecting awards since before your grandmother was born, and none of the judges had ever needed someone to vouch for them. There are approximately 1,000 to 2,000 actively working geisha in Japan today, down from 80,000 at the 1928 peak. A single ozashiki evening at a top Kyoto tea house costs more than most people earn in a month. The introduction requirement still applies. The kenban still manages every booking. The training pipeline still runs from shikomi through maiko to geiko. The debt system still operates. The waiting list, if there were one, wouldn't have your name on it. The door doesn't have a handle on your side. Sir, you're not meant to find a handle. That's simply where the door ends. You can't find a Kyoto Ochiya on Yelp. You can't book one through Open Table. You can't walk into Pontocho on a Tuesday and ask for a table. The alley is barely wide enough to pass another person, and even if you squeeze through, none of the doors open for you without a prior relationship. You don't book a table. The Okasan knows who you are before you arrive, because someone she trusts stood in front of her and said your name out loud. Without that, there's no table. There's no conversation. There's just you, standing in a very narrow alley, which isn't a metaphor but is also a metaphor. Meanwhile, the Miyako Odori is still running. The Cherry Blossom Dance in Gyeongkobu has been performed every April since 1872, which makes it older than most countries' constitutions and considerably more punctual. The Kamigawa Odori in Pontocho runs alongside it. Both are ticketed public performances. You buy a seat, you sit in the seat, you watch. The curtain comes down, you collect your program, file out with everyone else, and walk back into the alley. Whatever happens after the curtain isn't a door that opens from your side. Your kimono still took 4 to 6 weeks on a Nishijin loom to produce. Your shamisen still cost several months of a craftsman's wages and required cat or dog skin stretched across the resonating body, which continues to be the most alarming sentence in this entire training pipeline. Your Okobo sandals are still 10 to 15 centimeters high and designed without reference to the concept of warmth. The Okia builds you for all of it in the usual way, with the usual cheerful precision. The debt ledger didn't take a decade off to wait for your opinion on any of this. Now, you arrived as a shikomi. The Okia fed you, housed you and billed you for both, with the same cheerful precision as a hotel that also owns your career. If you retire, After 15 years, after 1,000 ozashiki, after the okia has recovered the investment and then some, the kenban logs the departure and the ledger closes your column. If you leave early, the ledger notes the balance still outstanding. Nobody calls. Nobody writes a letter. The okia simply stops updating your column, and the debt sits there, patient and unnegotiated, like a house guest who's decided the question of their departure isn't currently on the table. No one says this out loud. The shamisen case is already packed for tonight's first engagement. The hanamachi is still there. Jionkobu, Jionhagashi, Miyagawacho, Pontocho, Kamashichi Ken. All 5 still operational. In January, when Kyoto drops to 3 or 4 degrees, you still travel between Ochaya in lightweight kimono through stone-paved streets, carrying your shamisen case. The Akobo sandals haven't changed. Your gait hasn't changed. The dim lighting inside the Okaya, kept deliberately low even after electric light became available, hasn't changed. The institution decided somewhere around the 20th century that atmosphere was non-negotiable and has held that position with the stubbornness of a piece of furniture that's too heavy to move and knows it. You spent the night tracking a debt written in flower and willow ink, learning why an edict that freed everyone changed nothing, and calculating how long it takes to walk on Okobo sandals across cold stone in January when your kimono has opinions about your pace. Male jesters handed off the entire profession, and somehow that became someone else's lifetime of unpaid training. The incense stick ledger was ticking the whole time. To the women who actually lived inside this system, you were not a myth, not a butterfly, not a misprint in someone else's novel. You were a person who spent years learning to do something extraordinarily difficult for a room that sometimes forgot to notice. That is worth saying plainly. Take a moment to appreciate your bed, your shoes which do not restrict your gait, the fact that no one is recording your evening in an incense stick ledger. Settle deeper into your pillow. Let it go. Sleep well.